On January 30th, 1649, a bitter winter wind swept through the streets of London, carrying with it a heavy silence as thousands gathered before Whitehall Palace. The mood was somber, the air thick with disbelief and dread. Before the palace stood a scaffold draped in black, flanked by soldiers who formed a rigid perimeter. This was no ordinary execution. For the first time in England's long and turbulent history, a reigning king, crowned by God and once considered untouchable, was about to be put to death by the order of his own people. The man they had condemned as a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer would soon meet the blade. The world was watching. Shortly after midday, the palace doors creaked open, and out stepped a man of slender build, 48 years of age, dressed in dark but elegant attire. He was accompanied by guards and Bishop William Juxon. The man was King Charles I. Though he walked toward his death, he carried himself with a solemn grace. Aware that the frigid air might make him tremble, and unwilling to be mistaken as fearful, he had worn an extra white shirt beneath his coat, a final act of calculated dignity. His expression was calm, even serene, and his pointed beard framed a face seemingly untouched by panic. As he ascended the scaffold, he came face to face with the two masked executioners. Their faces concealed, they stood prepared for a task many had refused to perform. Several English executioners had declined to raise an axe against their king, forcing Parliament to find someone from elsewhere. The execution block was set unusually low, requiring Charles to lie down completely, in a pose of total surrender. Yet even in this posture, his composure did not waver. Turning to the small group of authorized onlookers, Charles began to speak, delivering his final words with quiet intensity. He declared himself a martyr of the people and a good Christian, maintaining that he was not guilty of initiating the war against Parliament. "God is my witness," he proclaimed. But the majority of the crowd could not hear him. Soldiers maintained a constant drum roll, deliberately muffling his final testimony. After a brief silence, Bishop Juxon stepped forward and leaned in close, offering words of spiritual comfort. "Sire, there is but one stage more, which though turbulent, is very short. You may consider that it will carry you from earth to heaven." Charles responded with a single, haunting word: "Remember." With slow, deliberate movements, the king removed the Order of the Garter medallion from around his neck and handed it to the bishop. Then he removed his coat, tucked his hair beneath a white cap, and lowered himself onto the block. Stretching out his arms as a silent signal of readiness, he lay still. A moment later, the executioner brought down the axe in one clean, decisive stroke. The king's head was severed from his body and held aloft before the stunned crowd. "Behold the head of a traitor," the masked man shouted. A collective groan rose from the spectators, not of triumph, but of sorrow. Many surged forward, not out of vengeance, but in reverence. They dipped handkerchiefs in the spilled royal blood, desperate to preserve a piece of what they already believed was the relic of a martyr. On that icy afternoon, England had done the unthinkable. It had killed its king, and with that act, the country crossed a threshold from which it could never fully return. But how had it come to this? How had the sovereign ruler of England, ordained by divine right and born in a privilege, found himself alone on a scaffold, condemned by the very people he was meant to govern? To understand that moment of irreversible rupture, one must turn back the clock, back to the origins of Charles Stuart, and the storm of religious, political, and personal tensions that shaped his rise and ultimately led to his downfall. Charles was born on November 19th, 1600, in Dunfermline Palace, Scotland, the second son of King James VI of Scotland, who would later also become James I of England. As the younger sibling, Charles was not expected to inherit the crown. That destiny belonged to his elder brother, Henry Frederick, a bright, charismatic heir who embodied the promise of a new generation. In contrast, young Charles was frail, afflicted with rickets that left his legs weak. He was shy, soft-spoken, and suffered from a stammer that made public speaking a torment. He lived in his brother's shadow, overshadowed not just by health and strength, but by personality. Then, in 1612, tragedy altered the course of history. Henry, the pride of the realm, died suddenly of typhoid fever. In the blink of an eye, the future of the kingdom shifted. The reserved and physically delicate Charles was now heir to not one, but two thrones. 13 years later, following his father's death in 1625, Charles ascended to the throne of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But he inherited more than just a crown. He stepped into a world already crackling with religious and political friction. Three forces, above all others, would define his reign and ultimately contribute to its violent end. His rigid and inflexible nature, his unwavering belief in the divine right of kings, and his politically volatile marriage to a Catholic princess in a Protestant kingdom. Charles, though small in stature, standing just 5 feet 4 inches, carried himself with a regal presence. He compensated for his physical limitations with a strict sense of formality and ceremony. While his father James had been gregarious and approachable, Charles remained aloof. His quiet demeanor, coupled with his stammer, often came across as coldness, pride, or even disdain. He maintained a profound sense of royal dignity that few could penetrate. Yet it was his ideology, his ironclad belief in the divine right of kings, that truly alienated him from his people. Charles viewed monarchy as sacred. He believed that kings derived their authority directly from God and were accountable only to him. In his eyes, Parliament was not a partner in governance, but a consultative body, one that could be dismissed at will. This belief was not just outdated. It was dangerous in an England where the concept of shared power between sovereign and Parliament had deep historical roots. As Charles tried to govern without compromise, refusing to bend to political opposition and surrounding himself with unpopular advisors, tensions escalated. His marriage to Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic queen in a predominantly Protestant land, only deepened the suspicion that Charles harbored sympathies toward Catholicism. Over time, his relationship with Parliament deteriorated beyond repair. What followed was civil war, a struggle not just for political dominance, but for the soul of the nation. And at the end of that road, after years of bloodshed and betrayal, stood the scaffold at Whitehall. The execution of Charles I was not just the fall of a man, it was the collapse of a divine ideology, the violent birth of a new political age. And the question still echoes through history. Was Charles a martyr, a tyrant, or simply a man who could not change? The reign of Charles I began under a shadow of suspicion and unrest, much of it ignited by his marriage to the French princess Henrietta Maria. She was a devout Catholic, and in a kingdom where Protestant Anglicanism was not only the dominant faith, but also a central part of national identity, her presence was met with deep unease. England, still haunted by memories of bloody religious conflict, viewed Catholicism not merely as a spiritual difference, but as a dangerous foreign ideology, one that threatened to undo the hard-won Reformation. Charles's union with Henrietta Maria was seen by many as an ominous sign of where his loyalties might lie, and it did little to reassure a nervous public already skeptical of royal power. As soon as Charles ascended the throne, crisis followed. Determined to assert his authority and maintain England's standing abroad, he plunged the nation into expensive military ventures against Spain and France. These wars, poorly managed and largely unsuccessful, drained the royal coffers. In need of funding, Charles turned to Parliament, but he found their demands for a greater role in governance intolerable. When Parliament refused to grant the necessary subsidies without securing concessions, Charles dissolved it in 1629, opting to rule without it altogether. Thus began a period of governance that would come to be known as the Personal Rule, or, among his detractors, the 11 Years' Tyranny. From 1629 to 1640, Charles I governed without calling Parliament, a dramatic departure from established constitutional practice. In order to keep his government afloat financially, he resorted to archaic and controversial methods of taxation. One of the most resented measures was the extension of ship money, a levy traditionally imposed on coastal towns during wartime to support naval defense. Charles extended this tax inland and enforced it during peacetime, sparking outrage across the country. He also sold monopolies, privileges, and revived long-forgotten laws to impose fines on unsuspecting citizens. These moves were seen as desperate, even underhanded, and only served to further alienate both the nobility and the common people. At the same time, religious tensions were reaching a boiling point. Under the guidance of Archbishop William Laud, Charles pursued a series of religious reforms that many Protestants found deeply unsettling. The ceremonial nature of these changes, along with the emphasis on hierarchy and ritual, led many to fear a return to Catholic-style worship. Nowhere was resistance more fervent than in Scotland, where Charles attempted to impose a new Anglican-style prayer book. The Scots reacted with fury, and rebellion erupted. When Charles tried to quash the uprising, his forces were defeated. Financially crippled and militarily weakened, he had no choice but to summon Parliament once again in 1640. But the Parliament that gathered was not the submissive body Charles had hoped for. Led by figures such as John Pym, the members were determined to curb royal authority. They presented an extensive list of grievances and demanded sweeping reforms, including protections against the arbitrary exercise of power. Cornered and desperate for money, Charles reluctantly agreed to a series of humiliating restrictions, among them a law stating that Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. While these concessions bought him temporary peace, they did nothing to resolve the underlying conflict. In fact, as the king's power diminished, his determination to reclaim it grew ever more resolute. In January 1642, Charles made a catastrophic decision. Accompanied by armed soldiers, he stormed into the House of Commons in an attempt to arrest 5 prominent members of Parliament whom he accused of treason. It was a shocking moment, the first time in English history that a monarch had entered Parliament with armed force. But the attempt failed. The targets had already fled, and Charles left empty-handed, humiliated. More importantly, the act destroyed any remaining trust between the king and his subjects. His willingness to use military power against elected representatives was seen as an unforgivable transgression. The breach was now beyond repair. Shortly after this failed coup, Charles left London and began assembling loyal forces. By August of that same year, the royal standard was raised in Nottingham, marking the beginning of open warfare between the Crown and Parliament. The English Civil War had officially begun. What followed from 1642 to 1649 was one of the most violent and traumatic periods in the nation's history. Families were torn apart, communities divided, and blood spilled across the countryside. On one side stood the Royalists, or Cavaliers, supporters of the king. On the other stood the Parliamentarians, often called Roundheads, who fought for constitutional reform and religious freedoms. As the war dragged on, the parliamentarian forces underwent a transformation. Under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, they reorganized into a disciplined and effective fighting force, known as the New Model Army. Victory after victory tipped the balance in their favor. In 1647, Charles was captured. Parliament, hoping to avoid further bloodshed, offered him terms that would allow him to retain the throne in exchange for substantial reductions to his power. But Charles, steadfast in his belief in the divine right of kings, refused. Even in captivity, he continued to scheme. He held secret negotiations with the Scots, the French, and even rival English factions, hoping to ignite divisions among his enemies. His duplicity ignited a second phase of civil war. This renewed conflict, spurred by Charles's betrayal, exhausted what little patience remained among the parliamentarians. The idea of reconciliation was abandoned. Cromwell and the military leadership came to a grim conclusion. As long as Charles lived, peace would be impossible. In a move without precedent, they established a special court to try the king for treason. This was not merely a political act. It was a revolution in the very nature of English governance. Until then, the king had been considered the embodiment of the state itself, beyond the reach of law. To try him as a traitor to the nation was to declare that sovereignty no longer resided solely in the crown. The The trial commenced on January 20th, 1649. Charles, unwavering in his conviction, refused to acknowledge the court's authority. He maintained that no earthly body could try a monarch, least of all his own subjects. He refused to mount a formal defense, and his silence was taken as defiance. The outcome was all but certain. By denying the legitimacy of the court, Charles ensured his own downfall. A guilty verdict was delivered, and the fate of the king was sealed. On January 27th, 1649, Charles I was formally declared guilty of high treason against the English people. The sentence was death. For the first time in English, and indeed European, history, a monarch was to be executed by his own subjects following a public trial. The gravity of what was about to unfold sent tremors across the continent. Kings had been overthrown in the past, even assassinated, but never had a king been held legally accountable in such a public and symbolic way. The execution was not just a punishment, it was a statement. It declared, in no uncertain terms, that the king was not above the law. In the days that followed the verdict, Charles I faced his fate with a calm and almost haunting composure. Though confined and humiliated, he was not broken. He used his final hours to write, to pray, and to bid farewell to his children. He was allowed a brief and heartbreaking visit with his youngest children, Princess Elizabeth and Prince Henry. With great tenderness, he spoke to them not as a king, but as a father preparing them for a world without him. He advised them to remain loyal to their brother, the future Charles II, and to forgive those who were responsible for his death. To his children abroad, he sent messages of love, of duty, and of hope that the crown might one day be restored, not out of vengeance, but out of divine justice. The night before his execution, Charles slept soundly, rising early in the morning of January 30th, 1649, to dress for what would be the final day of his life. He chose his clothing with care, selecting 2 linen shirts to wear beneath his outer garments. When asked about this curious decision, he explained simply, "The weather may be cold, but I would not have the people think I tremble from fear." It was a final act of stoic pride, a kingly performance for the ages. Even now, with his power stripped away, he was determined to meet death with dignity. At around 2 p.m., Charles was led from St. James's Palace to the scaffold erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The platform was draped in black cloth and heavily guarded. A large crowd had gathered to witness the spectacle, though many stood in stunned silence. The moment was surreal. Here was a man born into absolute monarchy, divinely appointed by the laws of tradition, now kneeling beneath the blade of the executioner's axe. Charles addressed the gathered spectators calmly, his voice resolute and unshaken. He declared himself the King of England, the King of Scotland, the King of Ireland, and insisted that he had always sought the welfare of his people, even if they failed to understand it. He reaffirmed his belief in the divine right of kings and the sanctity of monarchy, stating that his own blood would now be a witness against those who had judged him. He forgave his executioners and those who had brought him to the scaffold, declaring his soul at peace with God. Then, with the quiet dignity that had marked his final days, he laid his head upon the block. A moment later, the axe fell. The deed was done. A low groan passed through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. It was as if the entire nation was holding its breath, unsure whether it had just witnessed justice or sacrilege. In the immediate aftermath, the monarchy was officially abolished and England was declared a republic, the Commonwealth of England, governed by Parliament and the army under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. The House of Lords was also dissolved, and the country embarked on a bold and radical experiment in republican governance. Cromwell would eventually rise to the position of Lord Protector, effectively ruling as a de facto monarch in all but name, supported by a Puritan military regime. Yet the republic, born out of revolution and idealism, would not last. Public discontent grew under Cromwell's rule, and after his death in 1658, the republic began to unravel. His son, Richard Cromwell, lacked the authority and support to hold the country together. Amid mounting instability and weariness of military governance, calls for the restoration of the monarchy began to grow louder. In 1660, the unthinkable happened. The exiled Charles II, son of the executed king, was invited back to England to assume the throne. The monarchy was restored, but it would never again enjoy the unchecked power of the past. The execution of Charles I had fundamentally altered the contract between ruler and ruled. From that moment forward, English kings and queens would be sovereigns with limits, bound by law and subject to Parliament. In a strange twist of fate, the man who had been vilified as a tyrant in life began to acquire the glow of martyrdom and death. On the very day of his execution, a book mysteriously appeared, titled Icon Basilike, or The Portrait of the King. It claimed to have been written by Charles himself during his imprisonment and presented him as a pious, suffering servant of God, wronged by his enemies and faithful to the end. The book became an immediate sensation, widely distributed and passionately read across England and Europe. Whether or not Charles truly authored the text, its impact was undeniable. It helped reshape public memory of the king, transforming him from a failed autocrat into a Christ-like figure, sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. The Church of England embraced this new narrative, declaring Charles a martyr and establishing January 30th as a day of remembrance. In churches across the land, prayers were said in his name, and sermons were preached in his honor. His legacy, once stained by civil war and accusations of tyranny, was now shrouded in reverence and sorrow. Thus, Charles I, in death, achieved what he could not in life. He became a symbol, not of absolute monarchy, but of the enduring complexity of power, faith, and human conviction. His execution had sent shockwaves through the foundations of European monarchy, challenging centuries of divine rule. It was a moment that forced an entire nation to confront uncomfortable questions about authority, justice, and the rights of the governed. And in the echoes of that axe blade, a new political order slowly began to take shape, one in which no king would ever again rule without the consent of the people. The political legacy of the execution of Charles I is arguably one of the most profound and enduring consequences of the English Civil War. Though the monarchy would later be restored with the return of Charles II, the ideological ground had irreversibly shifted. The notion that kings ruled by divine right, answerable only to God, was dealt a fatal blow. With the fall of Charles I came a revolutionary principle that echoed far beyond his time, that no ruler, however anointed or exalted, stands above the law. This principle would take root in the English political consciousness and, decades later in 1688, be codified into the very fabric of the British Constitution through the Glorious Revolution. That moment cemented the supremacy of Parliament and imposed permanent legal limits on the powers of the Crown, laying the foundations for what would become a constitutional monarchy. Yet the impact of Charles's execution did not end at England's shores. The shockwaves reverberated across Europe, where monarchies looked on with horror. The spectacle of a sovereign being tried, condemned, and publicly executed by his own subjects was unprecedented and terrifying. Among those most deeply affected was the young Louis XIV of France. Though still a child at the time, he witnessed from afar the spectacle of regicide and internal chaos. That trauma would shape his worldview and his rule. As king, he embraced the philosophy of absolute monarchy, famously declaring, "L'état, c'est moi, I am the state." His centralization of power, strict court control, and extravagant reign at Versailles were, in many ways, a defensive response to the threat posed by the English example of rebellion and the overthrow of royal authority. Back in Britain, Charles I has remained a figure of debate and contradiction. To some, he is remembered as an obstinate and authoritarian ruler whose refusal to yield or negotiate plunged the country into years of bloody civil war. His rigid belief in his divine mandate and his resistance to parliamentary reform painted him, in their eyes, as a tyrant. Yet others see him in a different light, as a man of unwavering principle, whose downfall was less a product of evil intent and more the result of a tragic inability to adapt to a changing world. He believed in his role, his God-given duty, and he faced his death with calm, dignity, and even grace. That final image of a composed king walking to the scaffold has done much to soften his historical image. Over time, it allowed his supporters to frame his execution not as justice served to a despot, but as martyrdom, death for a cause, for tradition, and for monarchy itself. Ironically, the execution intended to abolish monarchy instead ushered in its most stable and enduring form. In removing the king, the English revolutionaries introduced the idea that leadership must be accountable, that power must be limited, and that governance must serve the people, not the other way around. Constitutional monarchy, the system that would later flourish in Britain and inspire similar models worldwide, was born not in royal triumph, but in royal demise. On that wooden scaffold, where the axe fell and history shifted, a modern concept of government took root. One where law, not lineage, was sovereign. Even today, the echoes of that moment remain. Each year, on the anniversary of Charles's execution, a modest ceremony is held at his burial site. White roses are laid, symbols of remembrance for a monarch who, whatever one's judgment of his reign, met his end with a solemn composure that transcended the brutal politics of his era. His death, while tragic, offered a moment of reflection that still prompts historians and citizens alike to ponder the complexity of power, principle, and legacy. And so, the question continues to be asked: was Charles I the architect of his own downfall, undone by pride, obstinance, and political misjudgment? Or was he a victim of unstoppable historical forces, caught in the violent clash between tradition and progress? The truth lies somewhere between these extremes, in a shadowed middle ground where human character and historical momentum collide. Charles I remains a puzzle, a king both condemned and commemorated, flawed yet dignified, remembered as much for the end he met as for the reign he lived.